get settled. Yeah. At least people don't have to travel out in the cold to the lecture. One of the advantages of online lectures is that
I know.
those cold, wet winter nights, which is
Especially this week, I think, was it Storm Barrows arriving tomorrow as well? So it'll be an absolute washout, I think, as well.
8 o'clock partly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning or something. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see what if there's disruption to trains and things like that.
Yeah.
At least snow hasn't come yet. But the way I was feeling coming home from Queens tonight, it could well freeze over the roads. I'm just thinking tomorrow.
Well, I wouldn't be. I think the gritters are already out as well, so I think they're prepping for it definitely.
Oh gosh, okay.
I think definitely the West Coast. I think are going to get hit with snow. As far as I'm aware, I could be wrong, but
right. Oh, it's too early for a white Christmas.
Practice run.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, just a couple of more minutes if you don't mind, Michael. Just give it to 25 and then I'll say a quick introduction and hand over to you. Excuse me. Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to the last UAS lecture of 2021. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Michael O'Mahony. Michael is a visiting scholar within the School of the Natural and Built Environment, Queen's University Belfast. He's a medieval archaeologist who specialises in the tower houses of Britain and Ireland and the late medieval lorded landscape. He began in QUB in 2012, was awarded the John Hurst Prize in 2016 by the Society for Medieval Archaeology for his undergraduate dissertation entitled Access Analysis and the Gaelic Tower Houses of Northwest Ireland. He got his doctorate in 2020 for his thesis entitled Spatial Analysis and the Late Medieval Tower Houses of Britain and Ireland, and is currently, as we've said, a visiting scholar at Queen's University Belfast, with his research focusing on reconstructing the original environs of Ireland's tower houses using archaeological and historical evidence. And Michael's a good friend of the Ulster Archaeological Society, and we remember his excellent talk at the Discovery 2020 conference. Tonight, Michael's going to talk on reconstructing Ireland's castles, an archaeological interpretation of the environs of the Irish Tower House. I'll hand over to you now, Michael.
Thank you very much, Rory, and thank you everybody very much for joining this lecture. So, as Rory was saying, most of my academic career was focusing on tower houses of Britain and Ireland, and as part of my PhD, I provided the first systematic analysis of tower house design across Britain and Ireland. The reason I decided to do this lecture came out of the results of one of my chapters, which provided a functional analysis of the tower house design across Britain and Ireland. I was specifically focused on looking at the defensive and domestic elements of their design. And I noticed that In comparison to England and Scotland, Ireland's Tower House environs are reasonably bare and very plain, and ostensibly most of the Tower Houses appear to be isolated features in the landscape, when in reality this is far from the case. So this lecture is very much an invitation to everybody here, whether they're from an archaeological or historical background, to reassess the archaeological landscape in which these structures are located, and you have to reassess how they were originally presented more than half a millennia ago. So a tower house, for anybody who's unfamiliar, is the most common form of lordly residence that was constructed during late medieval Ireland, which is roughly between 1300 to about 1550 AD. They were constructed by virtually every major Gaelic Irish and Anglo-Irish family in Ireland, respective of territory or ethnicity. And there were approximately 3,000 of these structures constructed across the landscape. I always like to use this slide of Blarney Castle as a demonstration of what a tower house is. And it feeds very much into the second point of this slide, in that tower houses are the architectural representation of the lordly authority of that particular family. In this case, Blarney Castle was the primary residence of the McCarthys of Cork. And as you can see, it clearly dominates the landscape. Tower houses have a multi-story oblong format. They typically consist of a cellar, a hall, a residential accommodation in ascending order linked by a spiral staircase. But I'm not really interested in talking about the tower houses per se in this lecture. I'm more focused on the structures around the tower house and how they actually help the tower house and its occupants function on a daily basis. The reason I ask this question, what makes a castle, is that given the relative isolation of many of these structures in the rural landscape of Ireland, people have a tendency to assume that the tower house is the sole constituent of an Irish castle, and therefore the tower house itself can be attributed the title of castle. Although this is technically the case if you look at 15th century or even 16th century documentation where many tower houses are indeed referred to as castles, you have to put the tower houses themselves in their wider context. A tower house is just a single but a necessary major component of a castle complex. They are the private accommodation of the respective lordship or chieftain at that particular castle. And they very much, the Irish tower house complex very much follows a similar format to that of the high medieval Motte and Bailey, in that it was the administrative centre of the rural landscape of Ireland. The original medieval format, as I'm sure you can all imagine, would have contained enclosing walls, known as the bawn, would have included structures such as the banqueting hall and kitchen, which I'll investigate further. But it also contains economic structures which are located outside the actual periphery of the bawn or enclosing wall, such as warehouses, mills, orchards, and other things. It's all well and good if you are a Anglo-Irish or Gaelic Irish lordship and you can afford the funds to build a tower house. But unless you can actually afford a garrison to defend the castle, then the tower house itself is a defendable structure, but not necessarily a defensive structure. It's not actively a defensive structure. At best, in those situations, if you don't have a garrison, it is a retreat tower in which your family can retreat to in the event of a siege or a raid and hope for the best. Really, most of Ireland's tower houses were not built to withstand the great armies of the Elizabethan or Cromwellian era. They would be very easily, as you will see later, decimated by any siege warfare. The more immediate threat to any Irish chieftain or lordship is one of two groups of people: A, your neighbours, or B, members of your own family. And so they're really basically meant to defend against localized raiding parties, small group of bandits who want to get in and raid livestock or other essentials. There are two basic defensive structures which I will outline in this presentation. The first is the bawn or the enclosing wall. It's not necessarily a masonry wall, but sometimes they can be. And they are the most common archaeological survival at Irish tower house sites. But even by that standard, they aren't especially common, as Tom McNeill actually says. It's more than likely that about a fifth of tower houses have masonry bawns. The most practical solution for any Irish chieftain or lordship who wanted to build any defenses around the Tower House would be to invest in manipulating the environment around the Tower House through earthworks. And I've chosen this example of Kilcraig Castle in County Cork, which is the McCarthy residence, because it contains an amalgamation of a masonry bawn, which you can see encloses the entrance to the Tower House, as well as a huge moat, which is a defensive earthwork. Most raiding parties, because they aren't particularly skilled, operate on the principle of minimum effort for maximum yield. They don't want any hassle when it comes to a Tower House. The second they see a garrison, most of them will turn away. So if you make as many earthworks or embankments as possible and make it as physically difficult to actually access the approach to the castle, that would usually be enough to deter any raiding party from accessing the castle. So as I was saying earlier, the Tower House alone is a private residence of the Irish chieftain or lordship. It's not usually common for the Irish lordships to invite people into the actual Tower Houses for dining experiences, but it is possible if you are a dignitary or a member of your own family. More often than not, you would have to rely on the ancillary or external structures of the Tower House to provide basic domestic support towards the castle. Because bear in mind, it's not just your family. You've got an entire household. You have to worry about your guards, your stewards, if you have a smithy, masons, anybody working at a castle. They need residences too within the castle and also places to eat and commune. So obviously the first thing that jumps to mind when we think of domestic structures is the hall. And these are commonly timber or turf constructs, usually about a single story with a hearth in the center for the preparation of meals. The hall actually represents the administrative center of the castle. The Tower House may represent the private abode, but the hall is the social center of the castle complex. And we do actually have two masonry examples at Ogdenure Castle in Galway, which is an O'Flaherty example, as well as Barryscourt Castle in County Cork, which is a Barry Castle. Occasionally, you would find kitchens as well. They aren't particularly common, but they are usually found and easily readily identified by the presence of bread ovens, which are a circular feature within the actual kitchens themselves. Most of them have been found through excavation. There's been an example excavated by Richard O'Croinin at Dishart O'Day in County Clare, as well as Parks Castle in Leitrim, which is an O'Rourke Castle by Clare Foley back in the 1970s. What I'd like to show you is this below a quote from Richard Stanihurst, who wrote in 1584. And he describes the Irish hall perfectly. He describes it as where they hold their banquets, but they also mentions the reason why the occupants tend to sleep in the castle. That's because you have such intense heat from the hearth, and even in the kitchen, because you have a hearth and an oven burning, there's an immediate fire risk as well from such structures outside the Tower House. So obviously it's good if you have these buildings detached and separate from the Tower House to avoid catching the blaze tower. So it's all well and good if you can construct the Tower House, but the problem is, how can you sustain yourself and your household as well as a local community? But you have to realize that because they are centers of the local rural landscape, you need to be able to manipulate the environment and to be able to control the natural resources to support not only yourself, not only your household, but also the wider community. What usually Tower Houses, they contain an enclosing wall or structure known as a bawn. And the literal translation of bawn is cattle enclosure, because at the time, Ireland's economy was largely pastoral. So that means it was largely based on livestock and how much cattle you had. And usually at the end of the day, the cattle will be brought into the Tower House courtyard. And occasionally you will find that a prize bull or prize animals were kept in the cellar of the Tower House as makeshift fire. But you also find some other economic features both within and without the Tower House environs. Dovecots are a common feature. As you can see here on the right, there's a fantastic example from Ogdenure Castle in Galway. This dovecot is actually not original. As you can see from the gun loops below, it was actually originally a part of the turret in the inner bawn of that particular site before it was converted to a dovecot in the 17th century. There's another reason why a dovecot would be considered essential apart from providing pigeons and doves for meat and manure. In Catholic theology, doves were considered to be emblematic of the Holy Spirit. And therefore, by keeping a series of doves, it would actually add to your lordly repertoire and increase your lordly status. And another common feature which I will explore in greater detail later are mills. Because Ireland has a significant number of rivers and streams and lakes, it makes sense to manipulate the local water sources, both for in terms of fishing. You could have fishing weirs like salmon weirs, you could have water mills and fisheries, and there's a significant number of economic structures that contribute towards the daily functioning of the Tower House complex. Unfortunately, as most of you are probably aware through your journeys throughout Ireland and Britain, most tower houses look very much like Roxtown on the right here, where you just have an isolated tower with no sense of any structure surrounding the building whatsoever. And what I did was, using ArcGIS, which is a geospatial analysis software, I created a 25-meter buffer around every single tower house in Ireland. And I find that a staggering 69% of the Republic of Ireland's tower houses have no discernible archaeological feature at all, which I find extraordinary, because the reality is most of these tower houses likely had a bustling community around them. And if you look at the Civil Survey, which is probably the most important source I will share with you guys today, even by 17th century standards, many of these tower houses were in very bad state. We have 33 ruined castles from Kildare, 25 ruinous castles from Limerick, and 36 irreparable castles from Tipperary. So by the 17th century, we can see a rapid decline in the actual structural integrity of many of these sites. Before I move on, I want to draw your attention to Roxtown Castle one more time. And I'll draw you this attention, this quote that is actually from the Civil Survey. And it references Ballynacarriga, which is basically Irish for the town of the rock, or Roxtown contains a castle and a bawn. We can see the castle, aka the Tower House, but where's the bawn? My argument here is that you can see there is significant archaeological potential at this site for a potential bawn. I reckon that the bawn was simply robbed away over the centuries. So that is why it's important to examine these historical documents in context with what you can actually see in the landscape today. Archaeologists are very lucky, especially Irish Castellogians who specialize in castles, that the post-Elizabethan and post-Cromwellian historical record is so detailed. And I have to draw your attention to these three very fine depictions of Irish tower houses, which come from the end of the 16th century. The image in the top right is Glynn Castle from Limerick, and it is a Fitzgerald castle that was owned by an individual called the Knight of Glynn. As you can see, it's quite a substantial site, as it contains evidence for a burning settlement to the right. This is when it's besieged in 1601, so you can see a burning settlement to the right, but you can also see a very substantial castle complex where you have a bawn enclosing the whole site. You have two flanking towers. We have another structure here, as well as post holes. And then we also have, rather extraordinarily, a banqueting hall. And during the siege of this castle, they couldn't actually break their way through the bawn. So what they did is that the English, whenever they reached the castle, they swam up this narrow channel beside the castle, broke through the hall in order to get access to the castle. Moving down to the bottom right, we have an image which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and this is the siege map of Enniskillen Castle in 1594. It is a Maguire Castle, and this is probably one of the finest representations of a Gaelic tower house in its original setting that you will find. As you can see here, Enniskillen is an insular site, completely surrounded by water and completely surrounded by a bawn. But we also have evidence of a gatehouse and a potential banqueting hall on the outside, but that remains to be determined. You also have a small boathouse at the bottom here, and what looks to be a gable-ended wall that may possibly be in the process of being constructed or deconstructed. And before I move on to the next slide, I will focus on Rathlahain Castle in County Clare. This is a castle that was fortunate enough to survive most of the demolitions and I will say atrocities, I suppose, of the 17th century. This castle was visited by an Englishman called Thomas Dinelly. And what you will see is that it's quite a substantial complex in that you have a bawn, but you can see a breach in the bawn, possibly to make access to the inner bawn. courtyard easier to facilitate for occupants. But you also have what appears to be a 17th century structure. And the reason I say 17th century is that if we go by Richard Stanihurst's account, most Irish tower houses had a thatched roof and were wrought and double. So I would be inclined to say this is probably post-medieval rather than 15th century in origin. It also has a possible stables on the outside. The reason I chose this image to display is you will notice in the top right a very unusual depiction of a comet. And that is because when Thomas Bindley was spending time at this castle in 1680, he witnessed a meteor shower at the castle, and he thought fit to include this depiction of the meteor shower in his depiction of the castle. So I think it's quite a nice depiction of how some of these images can be used to show important events in the history of Ireland. So these are the three main sources I'm going to share with you all today that are very important when it comes to interpreting particularly the post-medieval landscape of Ireland. Unfortunately, we don't have too many late medieval sources from the 15th century or even the 14th century outside the Annals of the Four Masters or even the Calendar of Ormond Deeds. So the Civil Survey, which I will talk about first, is probably the most important survey that I will talk about today. It was conducted in the late, after the Cromwellian conflict in the 1650s. It's basically an assessment of all the land in Ireland and land ownership patterns. And what I'm going to show you here is a depiction of a castle called Ballybricken in County Limerick. And as you can see, it describes a castle, a bawn, a dovecot, and other different types of features, as well as describing its location, the owners, and the type of field and the arability of the landscape. The second source I will refer to are the Inchiquin manuscripts, and this is quite a niche area in that it only focuses, as the name suggests, on the barony of Inchiquin, which was the remit of the O'Brien family of County Clare. But you do occasionally find documents relating to County Galway and County Limerick's castles as well. And the example I want to show you here is of Dromore Castle in Clare, in which it describes a castle, 6 messuages, which are basically dwelling houses. So apart from the castle, you have 6 other principal dwellings, and along with these dwellings, you have 6 gardens. And the last source I'm going to show you is a Calendar of Ormond Deeds, which contains the largest collection of medieval records in Ireland, and it's useful for examining how ownership patterns developed between the 14th century to the 17th century. And the example I've shown below is of Ballynaclaw Castle in Tipperary, in which it describes a castle, a hall, chapel with a thatched roof, and 2 rooms covered in tiles. So again, this shows the value of reassessing historical documents in line with the archaeological findings as well. Before I talk about the images in the slide, I want to draw your attention to one website which helped me enormously in the creation of this presentation, and that is the National Library of Ireland's Digital Archive. There is an incredible amount of untapped and possibly even unseen before photographs and sketchings from as early as the 17th century, in some cases for many of Ireland's castles. And quite often these castles have since been destroyed or significantly damaged and features lost over time. So I'm going to give you a quick whistle-stop tour of 4 of these castles. The image in the top left is of Capo Castle, which is a woodcock residence. And as you can see from this image, which was drawn by Gabriel Berenger in 1766, the tower house was already in ruinous condition, but you can see the remains of the enclosing wall or bawn, as well as the thatched cottage in the background. Unfortunately, the castle was destroyed little more than a century after 1860. So if this image was not digitized, there's a chance that many of us watching would have no idea of its existence. So that is why it is so important to consult the pictorial archive that are available as well. The image in the top right is a particularly exciting example of that I find very strange. It is of Grantstown Castle in County Laois. It's a circular tower house or a cylindrical tower house, which are primarily confined to Anglo-Irish areas of Ireland, but it was required by the Fitzpatrick family in the 15th century. The reason I say this image is so particularly interesting, as you'll all no doubt see, there is also a 2-story structure right attached to the tower house in ruinous condition. Why am I bringing this up? Because If you look at the SMR for Grantstown in County Laois, there is no mention of this building at all. And that is why it is so important to reconstruct the landscape, as I mentioned in my title, because buildings like this are clearly substantial enough that they should be included in the SMR. But I would mention at this stage, it's probably not fair to critique the SMR because many of these images were not digitized at the time that the SMR was compiled. So that's why I call for a reassessment of the Sites and Monuments record. The image in the bottom right is of Clara Castle in Kilkenny, which is another fantastic example of a tower house. The reason I'm showing this is that modern visitors to the site will actually have to drive up along this east wall because these buildings no longer exist, and it is now replaced by a short driveway which actually allows you to access the castle. So again, these structures, which may not necessarily be medieval or post-medieval, are still important enough to be interpreted as part of the life cycle of the castle. And of course, we come to the bottom left, which is Kinbane Castle in Antrim, which, as everybody knows, is a 16th century castle constructed by the MacDonald family, who were essentially a Gallowglass family that settled in Dalriada. And again, this is just a very small sampling of the potential of reassessing some of these sites. But of course, as archaeologists, the most direct way of actually discovering whether a site has external structures is actually get down and excavate the site. The image on the left is of the excavated O'Rourke Tower House at Parks Castle in Leitrim, as well as an excavated example of a kitchen that was discovered during excavation in the 1970s by Claire Foley. Because there's evidence of burning, one could readily assume that it must therefore be a kitchen, and it's usually a safe bet to assume that as such. And again, I'm sure everybody here would be very familiar with Dungannon Castle in County Tyrone, which is the O'Neill Bastion. And what we see here is the remnants of the Tower House, which was excavated by both the CIF and Time Team, as well as remnants of Lord Chichester's bastion set against the Tower House as well. Here are another two examples of excavations which are equally as important and show much more diverse structures. The image on the left is of an excavation plan of Barryscourt Castle in County Cork. The site was extensively excavated in the 1990s by David Pollock. And one of the structures I want to draw your attention to is this huge banqueting hall that is found adjacent to the actual tower house itself. But apart from that, there's a substantial bawn as well, with evidence for building ranges along each of the course of the bawn wall. And one example, the final excavation example I want to show you is of the excavated example at Dishart O'Day Castle in County Clare. This site was excavated in 1995 by Richard O'Coinan. And as you can see, the kitchen came out fantastically well. There's a very well-defined bread oven in the western corner. But apart from that, during the excavation, they were actually able to expose one of the corner turrets of the bawn, as well as the actual course of the bawn as well, in addition to a lime kiln, which may have been used in the construction of the castle as well. But in this case study here, I'm going to talk about Carrigafoyle Castle in County Kerry. Carrigafoyle is a very unusual tower house, not so much to do with its architecture, but also to do with its history. It was constructed in the early 16th century by the O'Connor family, so the tower house itself is a Gaelic Irish tower house. However, the O'Connors requested in the mid 16th century an Italian architect known as Captain Julian to construct a double bond enclosure, as you can see, around the actual perimeter of the tower house. But that's not all. So we have a Gaelic Irish tower house that was fortified by an Italian architect. But during the siege of the castle, as you can see on the left here in 1580, the castle was actually garrisoned by the Spanish. So you effectively have three different ethnicities and cultures involved in the construction of the castle. And the reason I chose this castle is I wanted to see, can we still detect the double bond in the archaeological record using drone photography? And I'm delighted to say that, yes, we can. Whenever I visited the site in 2019, and there's me just in the top right bar part for scale, I believe that this corner of the tower house of the castle complex, as indicated by the stars, is what we see in the map today. So as you can see, that is another potential to use of drone photography, which has really come into its own within the last 5 years, especially as everybody knows in the heat waves, how they used to find lost ring forts and that kind of thing. It's also equally important to be used for castle context to examine lost ancillary structures such as bonds. So this map here shows a breakdown of, in green, all these green dots here show every single tower house in Ireland. And all the red dots show all the ancillary structures and all the archaeological features within a 50-meter radius of these tower houses. Approximately 3,855 structures were identified. But as you can see, there's a couple of data problems. The big issue with the Northern Ireland Sites and Monuments record is that, unlike down south, all the evidence for ancillary structures such as bonds or banqueting halls or kitchens or guard towers are all contained within the single entry for the castle itself. So if you go to Audley's Castle, for example, in the Keel, everybody knows it has a very well-defined bond, but because it's contained within the record for the tower house, you therefore can't parse through the data unless you manually extract it. And the same for down south. Although it shows a very good spattering of ancillary structures, most of them are classified as unlocated in that they show up in the historical record, but because they can't be traced within the archaeological record, they're classified as unlocated, and therefore they do not have any geographic XY coordinates assigned to them. So once we strip away pre-medieval sites like Suderenes or early ring forts, for example, and strip down to what we consider late medieval structures, these are the most common structures we find. So as we can see at the top, 17th century houses are the most common structure we find, but also we find that churches are found in equal measure. But I will have to clarify for churches that a lot of these churches tend to predate the tower houses by some extent, because Christianity was here a long time before tower houses. You have to understand. So some of these castles were constructed adjacent to an earlier church, or in some cases, I will show later, was part of a joint project between monastic foundations and construction of tower houses at the same time. But we can also see here that enclosing walls such as bonds are also frequent, and also watermills. We also have settlement clusters such as the very famous deserted medieval village of Clonmines. We also contain a vast array of watermills, kilns, fords, and bridges and fish weirs. So there's a lot of features to dissect and to examine. Post-medieval houses tend to be the last major phase of development on each castle site. They tend to, in an example, be an amalgamation of several late medieval building types, in that most of them have residential accommodation such as bedchambers, but you also have post-medieval features such as kitchens or parlors or entrance halls. So post-medieval houses tend to be an attempt to amalgamate all the features of these original medieval buildings into one building. From the bottom left, we can see the McSweety residence at Doe Castle in Donegal. The building to the left is a two-story hall house. The bottom story was basically a servant quarters, kitchens, that kind of thing, whereas the upper story was effectively the banqueting hall adjacent to the courthouse. And we also contain here a very nice L-shaped flanking building constructed by GVH or George Von Hart. So he even went to the habit, to the difficulty of engraving his own initials on the construction of the building. Donegal Castle and Athlumney Castle are very similar, as you can see, in that the post-medieval houses very closely resemble each other, in that they tend to be fortified bay structures and they contain mullioned windows. The example at Donegal Castle was constructed by Sir Basil Brooke, and it contains a kitchen in the bottom story as well as residential accommodation in the upper story, whereas the upper example at Athlumney Castle was constructed by Bishop Dowdall, who was the Bishop of Louth, and he constructed an entrance hall and residential accommodation. And the reason I say it was constructed on the site of the original medieval hall is that sometimes you will find that the banqueting hall is either located directly opposite the entrance of the tower house or directly attached to it. So I wonder if the post-medieval houses simply represent the structural continuation of these buildings. If you're an Irish chieftain, you will undoubtedly know that your obituary would most likely be written by the ecclesial authorities in the annals, particularly the annals of the Four Masters. And as a result, more so than any element of your social life, you need to keep the church happy. And therefore, a good way of measuring your piety is through the construction of churches or monastic foundations. And during the 15th century, we see a spate of Franciscan foundations, particularly the Third Order of Franciscans, constructing monasteries throughout Ireland. And many of the major Gaelic families, such as the O'Donnells or the O'Connors and the Burkes, even go ahead and construct these monastic foundations adjacent to their tower houses, so that you would have secular protection through the construction of the tower houses, but spiritual protection through the construction of the churches or monastic foundations. And there's a particularly fine example I will talk about later at Kilcray Castle and Abbey at Cork, which is the burial ground for all the McCarthys. The bottom left shows you an example of what is a private chapel in Clara Castle at County Kilkenny. If you are lucky enough to maintain good relationships with the church, you could request a chaplain who resides at your castle and offer up daily mass or religious ceremonies at the castle. But more often than not, like an example, Burn Church at the top right, Burn Church, as the name suggests, refers to the earlier church there, which was known as Temple Patrick, I believe. It was part of the original diocese of Kells, which is Kells Priory. And the reason it's called Burn Church is that the original church was burnt in the 12th century and reconstructed, hence the name Burn Church. But the actual castle postdates the church by about 2 centuries. On the bottom right, the Church of Carrigafoyle Castle, actually a contemporary construct, and it was constructed most likely using the same masons who built the house as well. As I mentioned earlier, the exact translation of the term bawn means cattle enclosure. And this refers to the function and rather the form, because the reason so many tower houses, only a fifth of Irish tower houses to be precise, have masonry tower houses, is that most families spend their entire budget on constructing the masonry castles on the masonry tower house, and therefore do not have the budget or the means to construct the masonry bawn. So sometimes they construct a timber palisade around the tower house, or even, as I mentioned earlier, simply manipulate the earth to your advantage. And in keeping with Tom McNeill's hypothesis of 1/5 of Ireland's tower houses having bawns, the Archaeological Survey of Ireland only has about 309 tower houses out of 1,358 having bawns, which is about 23%. So that is perfectly in keeping with Tom McNeill's hypothesis. What I'm going to show you here is an example of 3 different types of masonry bawn. The bottom left, I will explore in more detail later, is Ogunure Castle in Galway, which is an O'Flaherty residence. And it's called a double bawn because you have what is here evidence of a masonry bawn or enclosure protecting the tower house, and then you have an outer bawn protecting the outer courtyard and other buildings around it. The example on the bottom right is what's more typical of your standard tower house, which is a single enclosing wall encapsulating the entire the castle complex. At Bungory Castle in Galway, which is no Hines residence. Occasionally, you will come across a tower house such as Clara Castle in Kilkenny, in which the bawn appears to be a very haphazard construction of the entrance to the tower house. This is known as a forecourt bawn because, as the name suggests, it only encloses the immediate area in front of the tower house, the entrance. And it's early 17th century in that it contains a significant number of gun loops and therefore can be dated to that century. So, to get into the actual meat of the presentation, I'm going to investigate one county from each province, namely Donegal, Wexford, Cork, and Galway. And in an attempt to reconstruct these castles, I will examine the documentary evidence from post-medieval sources. It will primarily lean heavily on the civil survey from predominantly Anglo-Irish territories such as Wexford, which is where it's most important and invaluable. But also I'm going to look at the early ordnance survey maps from the 1837 to see if there's any trace of these castles before they're effectively wiped off the face of the earth. Because many of these castles, many of Ireland's castles tend to have, if they're in an advanced state of decay or demolition, Most of them are most likely removed in the late 19th century. So the 1837 first edition Ordnance Survey provides the best indication of whether or not there was a castle there and what was in the immediate environs. I will join us together with the pictorial evidence from antiquaries, as well as obviously the archaeological survey to see if there's the potential for any of the archaeological records to have overlooked certain features. So what I've done to make life a bit easier in order to understand the original Gaelic territory or Anglo-Irish territories is that wherever I could, for example, for Donegal, I attempted to assign the name of the family behind the construction of the Tower House. So what I wanted to see, what was interesting, is that there was any spatial distribution of that particular family across the county, to see if any particular family is clustered in a particular area. So Donegal has about 14 tower houses exactly as recorded in the Sites and Monuments record down south. However, upon further investigation, there are about 32 unclassified castles. An unclassified castle is basically a fancy way of saying that the castle has either been destroyed in the post-medieval period, or the castle is simply being unlocated and they don't know where they are. And therefore, it is likely that because many of these unclassified castles have post-medieval activity or even mid-medieval activity, they are likely tower houses. Looking at the distribution map, we can see that the O'Donnell family have a very widespread distribution of their castles. As you can expect, in Inishowen, the O'Dohertys are the main family here. But we also see the Gallowglass family of the McLaughlins having 2 tower houses here as well. The McSweeneys are largely confined to northern Donegal. However, they breach very slightly into O'Boyle territory in the southwest. And then down here, we have the O'Clery residence of Kilbarron, which I will examine later. So as I said, one of the primary sources I'm looking at is the civil survey. There isn't a lot of detail in the civil survey for Donegal. In fact, as you can see, the details for Donegal from 1650 are kind of lumped in together for that of Derry and Tyrone, so we don't get that much detail. We do get a very brief summary of, for example, Inishowen here, the barony of Inishowen, where we have Birk Castle and Green Castle and White Castle and Red Castle being described. So we do get descriptions of some of these castles, but we don't really get any great detail as to who owned the castle. You can only really determine who owned the castle through a very detailed amount of forensic activity. So here's 3 examples of antiquarian depictions of Donegal's tower houses. The top right is an image I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Donegal Castle. Even as early as 1830, we can see it was in a state of rapid decay. In fact, there's a huge fissure going down the north wall of the tower house, but we can still see the bond is substantial enough to go around the majority of the site. The bottom right shows Rathmullen Castle, which is a McSweeney residence. And what I want to point out here is that the castle you see here is not only destroyed, but is actually not even the original castle constructed by the McSweeneys. The original McSweeney residence of Rathmullen was destroyed in 1516, either intentionally or accidentally through fire or potential hazard like that. And we do know that for the construction of the adjacent Carmelite Abbey, that the stones from the original castle that was demolished were used in the construction of that. And what we're seeing here is actually the second version of the castle, whereas we can see the tower house is still, it's in ruins, but it's still visible. And we also have a series of houses attached to it, as well as a bawn. The bottom left is of Termon McGrath Castle, which, as the name suggests, is a McGrath Castle. It's quite a late tower house in this series, but as you can see here, the bawn survives in significant detail. But what is unique about this castle is that we also have evidence of a settlement cluster at the end of the castle, as can be seen here in the thatched cottage bottom. So as I said, the reason I wanted to include the unclassified tower houses in this presentation is because I think a significant number of tower houses that are evidently tower houses, both for historical and structural reasons, have been overlooked for the very simple reason is they couldn't be found at the time of the creation of the SMR. So at the very top here, we have Rathmelton Castle, which was another late tower house constructed in the early 17th century. It's described as 3.5 stories high. It contains an adjacent house, a guardhouse, as well as a bawn of lime and stone. So it's quite a substantial site. On the bottom left is the O'Clery residence of Kilbarran Castle. What many of you may not realise is that the present tower house on the site is most likely a second or even third generation tower house. And I say that in that the castle we see today was most likely constructed to replace a pre-existing castle at the site. Because we see in 1390 in the Annals of the Four Masters that Kilbarran was demolished by Donald, the son of Murto O'Connor, of County Sligo. So what I want to kind of get across here is that often the history of the site predates the construction of the tower house as we see in the present day. And the actual site itself may be at least a century or two earlier than the tower house will have us believe. I have to say, whenever I was doing my research into Donegal, I was very surprised to see that Ballyshannon Castle, which is an O'Donnell residence, was classified as, well, unclassified. Because if we look at John Thomas's map on the top left here, who also did the siege map of Enniskillen Castle in Fermanagh, it is quite clear that Ballyshannon not only has a tower house, but it also has a bawn surrounding the site. We also see, as I mentioned earlier, there's also a monastic site of Assaroe Abbey adjacent to it as well. The fate of the tower house was after the 17th century, it's converted to a barracks. And I was looking at the 1837 6-inch map, and I wonder, if you look at the outline of the barracks, it seems oddly square in format. And my hypothesis is, in the process of demolishing the original O'Donnell construct, did they dismantle the bawn and construct the perimeter of the barracks on the original perimeter of the bawn so that the actual barracks followed the original delineation of the surrounding walls of the tower house? As you can see here, unfortunately, nothing is left of the old Ballyshannon Castle. The only thing we can see nowadays is a car park, and the only noticeable feature there is a plaque saying this is the site of Ballyshannon Castle, which is a great shame because it did play a major role in both in Donegal society as well as the politics of the O'Donnell family. So what I've done for each of the 4 counties is I downloaded a CSV file, Excel file from the National Monuments accounts down south. And I downloaded the data for tower houses and for unclassified castles. And what I did is I populated the data with information that was directly derived from the archaeological survey and from evidence I was able to find in the civil survey, in antiquarian sketches, and even the Ballyshannon pictorial references from the 17th century or from the 16th century even. And as you can see, there is a wide distribution of bawns in Donegal. However, they aren't universal, and in some reasons, it's just not possible in either documentary or the archaeological record for bawns at each of these sites. So unfortunately, it's unlikely a masonry bawn was ever constructed. However, it is equally likely that it could be an urban construct. And as for houses, as I mentioned earlier, because a lot of these houses do not are classified as unlocated because they have no structural content, many of these sites do not have XY coordinates for geospatial analysis, so we can only make do of what we have here. So as you can see here, 17th century houses are the most common survival at Donegal sites. However, we do have a few churches that were constructed in the immediate vicinity of two of the sites. And we also contain evidence for guard towers, which were likely attached to the bawns, both in Inishowen and down here in Kilbarran, which was attached to the bawn. Moving on to Wexford, which is the only Anglo-Irish territory I'd chosen. Most of the tower houses were constructed in the southern half of the county, just south of Enniscorthy. And there were about 65 tower houses in the county. However, I reckon there were about 103 to 105 unclassified castles that had the potential to be tower houses. And the reason I say 103 rather than 105 is because for 2 of these unclassified castles, there is no evidence of late medieval activity in the 14th, 15th, or 16th century. So therefore, I had to rule them out as potential tower houses. As you can see here in this distribution map, The Roach family were the predominant family in and around Wexford city itself, but you also see clusterings of families such as the Brown family right here, as the Keating family were also another prominent family in southern Wexford, and they have a wider distribution. Here we have a cluster of the Hoare family. We have a series of tower houses located here. So again, what I want to show you is how useful geospatial analysis and software like ArcGIS can be in attempting to reconstruct the original landscape, the lordly landscape of many of these counties. Now, fortunately, the civil survey is much better when it comes to looking at Wexford. As we can see in 1650, it's a much more systematic and clear approach than it was present in Donegal. What we can see here is an example of a Brown castle in the parish of Balrankin. And as we can see here in the far left, clearly defined as a castle, hall, and large bawn. So it sets out that these are three principal structures that were present at the site. But if we look at the bottom half of the screen, what I find very interesting is that this survey has effectively two different outputs, one looking at Irish Papists or Catholics, and one looking at English Protestant residences. So it's an ethnically divided survey, which I suppose is the product of its time. But what I find interesting is that it specifies the main types of residences that it wants to look at in this study. So we can see that castles, mills, fish weirs, like salmon weirs, for example, churches and abbeys are identified. So the good thing is that for Wexford, we have a significant number of sites that have these detailed evidence. And based on that, I was able to construct the following two charts. So based on the evidence from the civil survey, the most common gentry residence in type residence format in 17th century Wexford was a rather ambiguous title of castle, which had 59 entries. Castle can really mean anything. It can mean a tower house, it can mean a hall house, it can mean a tower house of a bawn, it can mean a tower house of a hall. It's very ambiguous and doesn't really get into much detail on that. But we also have in lesser degrees of consistency, stone houses, slate houses. By the time we get down to the least common residences, and these are residences that have only a single entry in the civil survey, really the combination of castles, bridges, bonds, weirs, manor houses, it starts to become all over the place and there's no sense of order. But we can appreciate at this stage the dedication and conviction of the actual surveyor to include these varieties of houses within the survey. We even have reference to a stone pile. A pile or a peel tower was the most common phrase used to describe these tower houses. And the word pile derives from the Latin pilum, which means wooden palisade. That would indicate to me that it's a stone tower house, but it likely had a wooden bawn around it. Here's a case study of a Wexford castle. This castle is Clough East Castle, which was constructed by the Cod family. The reason I wanted to highlight this castle is that there's a sketch in the bottom right here by William Frederick in 1840 that showed a 2-story and 5-bay late 16th century house attached to the entrance wall of the tower house. And this is unusual, and I'll tell you why. If this building, which is not, but if it was original, why would you have a matriculation and a garderobe chute overlooking the actual entrance to overlooking the actual building itself? That's a useful indicator for any archaeologist on the phone that the building you're looking at is clearly not original. Because don't forget as well, this tower house also has a portcullis guiding the entrance to the actual tower house. So why would you have a portcullis guiding the entrance to a tower house, which is connected and fed to your own house as well? Looking at the evidence from the actual tower house itself and the surrounding buildings, it was reconstructed in 2005, restored faithfully, but an additional story was added to the adjacent house. My interpretation would be, based on evidence of earlier reused masonry, that potentially it was an attempt to bring the original hall, or at least the functionality of the hall, closer to the actual tower house itself. So in terms of Wexford's unclassified castles, we are fortunate that the Archaeological Survey of Ireland online has uploaded snippets of the Down survey, which was contemporary with the civil survey. And the Down survey is effectively an attempt of a land survey. But unlike the sketches for Ballyshannon or Enniskillen or Glencastle, these cartographers were not interested in detail. They were more interested in examining the value of land and the delineation of land. Looking at the top left, we have an example of Tagunnon Castle, which we can see here is a very thin tower with evidence for a house attached to it, as well as two external houses or messuages, which are principal dwellings attached to it. The Tagunnon Castle was owned by the Rochford family since the 14th century. And despite being unclassified, it actually played a very important role in Wexford politics because Hugh Rochford was the sheriff of Wexford and also the commander of the rebels at Duncannon Fort. And this was his primary dwelling. So I do think it's unfair to call it an unclassified castle when it's actually the primary residence of such an important figure. The image in the middle, the bottom middle, is of Monart Castle, which was constructed actually in O'Brien territory in 1540, but is recorded in the possession of Henry Darnell in 1599. Again, as you can see, it's evidence of a tower house in the center with two houses on either side. And the image in the top right is of Ballymacane Castle. And I want to add this because it looked very odd. Why is there a huge black scribble or a black smudge across the actual depiction of this castle? My interpretation, if you can look very carefully, is that it possibly delineates, you can see a possible bond poking through. And this castle was owned by the Stafford family, and the castle was largely demolished by 1750, which is little more than about a century after this castle was depicted in the survey. And there was a date stone at the site, and I know what date stones are like and the reputation they have. I'm not archaeologists, but I find it funny that a date stone is inscribed as 1612 with the names of John Dionysius and Richard Stafford. Personally, I think it's too good to be true. I think it's an attempt to reclaim the castle landscape for the original family. So again, what I did was I examined all of Wexford's tower houses and unclassified castles, and using the evidence from the SMR, the Sites and Monuments Record for down south, as well as pictorial and documentary evidence, I was able to reconstruct the original environments of many of Wexford's castles. And as we can see, there's actually a very similar number of bonds as there is 17th century houses in Wexford. I suppose that's because many of these castles continued to be maintained and lived in up until the 18th century, so the process of decay was not as pronounced. But we do contain some interesting sites. We do have 4 tower houses that were constructed on top of noted sites, which again represents a continuation of occupation. We also have rabbit warrens, mills, and malt houses, as well as armorial stones. So again, if we look at the distribution map on the far left, because most of Wexford's tower houses are clustered near the bottom half of the county, the north south of Enniscorthy, most of the surviving evidence is from this area. And as you can see, 17th century houses are about as early as we get for post-medieval buildings, but we do get a staggering 18th century houses around the periphery of the county. And looking to the right, again, the survival of the bonds tend to be a bit closer towards the coastal regions of south and southwest Wexford. But in many cases, the bond do not survive in enough detail to make a determined assumption of whether or not there actually was one present. So my second last case study is on Cork. Now, Cork, as you can imagine, is one of the biggest and most densely populated castellated counties of Ireland. There are about 133 tower houses that we know of for sure, and an additional 162 unclassified castles that I would consider, on reflection and on hindsight through looking at the historical data, were more often than not likely tower houses as well. This is actually my favorite map to produce because it shows you how nice and neat the distribution of many of these different Gaelic families were. And it was predominantly Gaelic in the southwest of the county because on the border of Waterford and Kilkenny, it tends to be predominantly Anglo-Irish. So in the north of the county, in the dark blue, we have the Barry family. They are settled around here in North Cork, but also around Cork City. And the reason they're so densely dispersed around the county is because they had a habit of intermarrying with a lot of the Anglo-Irish as well as the Gaelic Irish families. So this is not evidence of conquest, but rather of intermarrying and building connections and ties. The Roach family, again, had a major presence here as well. And next door to them, they had the Condon family, who are on the border with Waterford and Kilkenny. The Fitzgerald's remit is very much east of Cork on the border of Lismore. But for my family, and I will tell you this for a fact, the O'Mahonys are probably the most southerly based family in Ireland. And I hold that as a matter of pride. I know for a fact that Dunmanus Castle, which is one of the castles I examined as part of my thesis, is located just right there, just in the middle. It took me about 4.5 hours to drive down to the site from my home in County Down. So it felt as much a pilgrimage for me to revisit essentially my ancestral homeland, which is quite nice, and be able to see them so clustered together shows the advantage of using GIS, because we can even see next door that the O'Driscolls were effectively the O'Mahony's neighbours. So again, this is another benefit of using GIS. My favourite tower house by far in Ireland, I say this without hesitation, is Kilcraig Castle in County Cork. It was originally the main residence of the McCarthy family of Muskerry. And the McCarthys, as you can possibly know, were the dominant Gaelic family of County Cork in late medieval Ireland. I think if you look at the archaeological record, Kilcraig Abbey, which is a Franciscan foundation, was constructed just across the road from Kilcraig Castle, about 200 metres away. And Kilcraig Abbey was used as the main ancestral burial ground for the McCarthy lordships. And it is likely that Kilcraig Castle was also built at the same time as well, most likely as a residence for the Taoiseach or the hereditary heir of the McCarthy chieftainship. It is considered the twin of Blarney Castle because it is built on the exact same structural format as Blarney Castle, in that it has the exact same window types, the exact same location, and it contains a vault on the first and third floor. But what I want to draw your attention to, aside from the fantastic tower house on the right, is the very rare example of a residential tower. And there are two types of towers I found attached to the bonds of these tower houses. There are residential towers, which, as the name suggests some degree of habitation, and flanking towers, which are usually perforated with gun loops and have a more defensive element rather than a domestic element. So as you can see, this is the inner courtyard of the McCarthy Castle at Kilcraig. It is a 3-storey structure and is accessed by the wall walks on both sides. It is a rather comfortable potential guard tower. It contains foot lockers and a garderobe. And as you can see, it also contains a wall walk which dominates the local landscape. This was actually taken from the 3rd floor inside the tower house. And again, it is a significant archaeological structure, which I think should be classified in its own right away from the bond itself. In terms of course unclassified castles, what I want to show you here is how important it is to look at the local landscape for different site types, because quite often these any structures that aren't recorded in the archaeological survey usually show up in the 1837 Ordnance Survey maps. The top left we have Ballyknock Castle, which is likely a Fitzgerald castle because it was constructed in the Fitzgerald territory, but it was also constructed within a rath or a ring fort and has a cedar and a standing stone adjacent to it. The bottom middle, as you can clearly see, is a very well-defined moated site. And again, there's no historical documentation for it, other than that it's constructed in Barry territory. And therefore, I'm inclined to say it's a Barry construct. On top right, as you can see here, fairly clearly defined evidence for a bond that the cartographer went to the effort of drawing. The tower house is in the bottom right corner, and the bond is very clearly defined. And we have 2 circular flanking towers at opposing corners of the tower house. It was referenced as a O'Callaghan residence from the 15th century onwards. So again, I went to the effort of reconstructing the original landscape of Cork's castles. And as you can see, as you can imagine, a staggering 82 of Cork's tower houses likely had bonds. And these are flanked with the residential towers, which I would classify as a separate archaeological feature, as well as 17th century houses. We do have 6 examples of halls, including the excavated example at Barry's Court, as well as an example at Ballincollig. But we also contain a high smattering of shield and the gigs, as well as promontory forts. You have to remember that in southwest Cork, there's a lot of forts like Dunmanus Castle, and a lot of castles beginning with the name Dun, which implies the name fort. As you can see from distribution of bonds, they're kind of finding three linear patterns. Huge spattering of bonds in the Anglo-Irish territories in the north, as well as in central Cork following the rivers, as well as along the coast. Bonds with flanking towers and residential towers generally don't have a very solid distribution. Flanking towers kind of have a C-shaped distribution and are found dispersed throughout County Cork, but residential towers, as I highlighted at Kilcraig Castle, have a much more linear distribution around the centre of the county. And again, from the geographic coordinates I was able to project, there's a higher survival of post-medieval houses, such as halls and 16th century buildings in Anglo-Irish territories than there is in Gaelic Irish territories. So the last case study I'm going to examine is Galway. Galway has about 125 tower houses in the county and about another 136 that are unclassified that I would argue are tower houses. In terms of distribution, you can see that the O'Kelly family is very much dominant in North Galway, east of Tuam, but the Clan Rickard and the Clan William Burkes are the main Anglo-Irish family, and they kind of spattered throughout North and South Galway. In the west, we have the O'Flaherty family, which are around west of Lough Corrib. Around Galway town, we have the Lynch family, and down on the border of Clare, we have the O'Hines family of Kinvara, and we also have the O'Shaughnessy's as well. So in terms of civil survey and relevant documentation, there isn't a great deal of detail. As you can see in the top right, at the time of transcribing the civil survey, it was hoped at the time that there was an Inquisition from 1574 showing the main castles and residents and lordly occupants would be published and therefore brought to the attention of the surveyors, but this actually wasn't done in time. So the actual number of tower houses being represented or castles represented in this survey is very low. We do get some useful information. So for example, we have from County Galway an O'Flaherty castle belonging to Miro O'Flaherty, and his mother is described as a castle, a church and little mill, but it also shows who is the overlord or the main landlord as well. So also in County Annadoon parish, we have a Lynch castle described as a castle in a bond and good repair, and this is owned by the Archbishop of Tuam. So we do get detailed information like this. So this is one of the more exciting finds that I find bewildering in that it was not recorded in the Sites and Monuments record. Clare Galway Castle was the primary residence of the Clan Rickard, Clan William Burkes, who were the main Anglo-Irish family in County Galway. As you can see here on the left in a sketch by James Stark Fleming, there's very clear evidence for a water mill as evidenced by the water wheel there. However, this is not recorded in the Sites and Monuments record, despite the building still surviving to this day. I think, again, this is an example of this information not being as accessible in terms of these antiquarian sketches to the people who actually made the SMR. Again, some interesting facts about the castle include this tower house is one of the few that have been reliably dated through radiocarbon dating. Rory Sherlock dated the site to between AD 1407 to 51 and 1406 to 47 based on the radiocarbon dating of the wickerwork. In terms of wickerwork, wickerwork centering is a common practice found in Ireland, usually found under the haunches of the vault or the soffits of the windows. And again, it's usually composed of hazel or willow. If any survive, you always take a sample on radiocarbon data to get a good, accurate reading of the date. So an example I'm going to show you here is of Ogdenure Castle, which is one of Galway's best preserved castles. It is a double bond enclosure. It contains evidence for a banqueting hall, flanking towers, and dovecot, as I shown earlier. It was the primary residence of the O'Flaherty family. But the history of the family of the O'Flahertys of Ogdenure is tied in with the famous O'Malley family of Mayo, because although the original castle was constructed in the late 15th century, the castle was besieged by Miro O'Flaherty, who was the son of the famous Irish chieftain and pirate queen Grace O'Malley, or Gráinne O'Malley. Because he besieged his own castle, it goes without saying the O'Flahertys disowned him, and Grace O'Malley actually struck an alliance with the O'Flahertys and convinced many of his own family members to abandon him and stop supporting him and move over to Mayo with her. So this is basically a consequence of basically attacking your own family's castle and the consequences of such. The case study I'm going to show you here is that there's one O'Flaherty structure that was removed in 1940, and it's arguably, I would call, a very significant part of the castle, because although the castle was effectively abandoned in the 17th century, it was maintained by members of the O'Flaherty family who may or may not be part of the main family. In the 19th century, a two-story house was built against the Tower House by a man called Edmund O'Flaherty, who was simply the postmaster of the local area, and he wanted to maintain the castle. And in 1952, the castle was actually surrendered to the OPW by Peter O'Flaherty. But in the process of restoring Tower House, I wonder if they made a major oversight by actually destroying the 19th century building. Because I think in 1940, it's not the worst condition for a two-story house, and could they not have redeveloped that site into a visitor complex? Because most of the people who visit the site have to walk through past a major gap between the hall and the Tower House to get there. So again, I think it's an example of selective reconstruction gone wrong. So again, I plotted all the Galway's castles in a spreadsheet like thus, but this time, because there was a significant number of double bonds, I've also included that as a filter in the spreadsheet as well. And again, bonds are very much a dominant feature in this chart. There's over 77 in Galway alone, followed closely by 17th century houses. But further down the line, we could also see that at least 5 of Galway's tower houses were constructed within castles, like directly within them, as opposed to basically be located nearby. And you also contain some very unique and niche types of sites such as Killiney or Sheila na Gigs as well. So again, huge spattering of bonds, particularly in mainland Galway, just east of Lough Corrib. Double bonds have a much more sparse distribution, being primarily found around the borders of the county. Not much can be really obtained from this, other than that bonds were considered a necessary defensive feature for many of these sites. And again, for 17th century houses, a lot of them could be found in the historic settlement of Galway itself. But also we could find some 18th century houses actually just south of this as well. Halls are not a particularly common feature. One is found at Ogan Europe there. There's also some more sparsely distributed. So these distribution maps kind of give you a rough idea of where these main types of buildings are, but they don't necessarily indicate any natural evolution or structural or spatial distribution of these buildings. So I'm on my last half dozen slides here. I'm getting near the end. I'll be happy to hear. Second case study I want to talk about in terms of selective reconstruction is the same castle I highlighted in my introductory slide, is Dishart O'Day, which is an O'Day castle. And it famously has one of the few examples of a banqueting hall. How do we know it's a banqueting hall? Because we have 3 sources from the Inchiquin manuscripts below that clearly mention that there's a hall, and a great hall at the site. Now, I do object somewhat to the reconstruction attempt of this castle. I must mention that the castle was reconstructed around the 1950s by an American who, by virtue of the fact that his surname was O'Day, he took it upon himself to purchase the castle and begin reconstructing it. But as you can see, the reconstruction of the hall seems to be a complete primarily fabrication. The only discernible medieval elements of the hall appear to be the gable end walls. So most of the structures here appear to be original in that respect. But as you can see, it appears to be I don't think this is the original bond wall, but I think it's an attempt of reconstructing the bond wall in the late 19th century. But I still think it's nonetheless an important feature to record. The Tower House is also home to the County Clare Archaeological Museum, and each of the windows actually have their own display of features from the original Tower House. In this case, this is an example of the original OG headed window, which belonged to the banqueting hall. And it wasn't until 2 months ago when I zoomed in on the actual soffits that you can actually see anthropomorphic faces on both the soffits. So this would be clear evidence to me that it clearly was an original feature belonging to the banqueting hall, but I think it would have been nice if they made an attempt to reinsert it. So as I mentioned earlier, I think it's important to understand that tower houses, because they are late medieval, they are not necessarily the first construct of a particular tower or keep at that particular site. It's quite often that the site predates the tower by at least a century. Tower houses are very much an evolution in terms of archaeology. They aren't a radical new concept. I mean, even if you look at the timber towers atop modern Bailey castles or in 13th century hall houses, the format and the plan was already there, but tower houses were able to attempt to make them more rectilinear and more multi-story and multifunctional. The tower houses, as I mentioned, could have been constructed in the 15th century, but the site predates them by at least a century or two. An important example I would mention on the right-hand side is Blarney Castle, where you can very clearly see that it's a very clear sectional divide down the center. The original tower houses on the right-hand side, the small slit windows here are part of the original spiral staircase. It is likely this tower house was originally a retreat tower for the McCarthy family. It was built around the early 15th century before the main tower house was added onto it. So it's important to reassess these sites in the context of the site history, because the site may have early medieval origins, it may have 14th century origins, and the site itself, as an example at Blarney, you may even have a first generation tower in which a second generation tower was added onto it. So this is my second last slide. I'm getting very near the end. I apologize, Bertie, and I'm going to be running over time, but I'll run through this. So this is the only example of a castle contract that we have from the early 16th century. And this is for an Anglo-Irish gentleman called Richard Butler. And rather than have you read through all of this detail, I'm going to basically chop through the main components of it. So in terms of the actual design of the tower house, it is described as having 3 lofts or rooms below the roof, in which the first loft is vaulted, which implies it's a cellar. It's the first loft, that's 14 feet high. Subsequent stories are 10 feet high, and the roof's covered with slate. Now, what it does mention is that there are 2 chimneys that are attached to the upper rooms, and that would obviously imply the presence of fireplaces. It also mentions in the sentence afterwards, there's a substantial presume with Drought's recording. Even the transcriber of this account has no idea what a presume is. It just got lost in translation. But I presume it means one of the fireplaces attached to the chimneys. The bone is described as a good substantial brevican of stone. And the castle here mentioned at Polyweary was identified possibly as Pullakerry Castle in Tipperary by Rory Sherlock in 2010. And the good thing is that this is actually another Butler castle, which is in all likelihood probably the design basis of this castle. And the castle gate is described as protected with a yett. So again, overall dimensions, castle's been built with lime and stone. 6 foot thick walls are about standard. 1.8 meters to 2 meters is about standard for most tower houses. Obviously, it goes about saying that doors and windows are a necessary addition. But we also get something interesting here, in that we just get a description of who's financing the castle, namely a Mr. Darby Ryan, the treasurer of Lismore. We also get a mention of a mason and a carpenter who's involved in the construction of the castle. So again, this is a very detailed description of the castle being constructed. Unfortunately, it's actually unknown what castle this is or whether it's actually constructed, but it nonetheless gives a good idea as to the complexity of castle construction. So all good things must come to an end. So this was very much a whistle-stop tour through 4 counties of Ireland, which I think were in dire need of being reassessed in terms of the complexity of their castles. But what I hope you guys gain from this is that Irish tower house complexes are far more sophisticated sites than we actually give them credit for. And I think we need to get into the habits, especially with the likes of climate change and gradual punctuated decay of these buildings, to get into the habit of stopping at these sites, recording them digitally via photography, 3D modeling, or as a 19th century Antichrist done, sometimes a good old-fashioned sketch is important. And ultimately, the most important lesson I hope you obtain is that in order to reconstruct a castle complex, you need to first deconstruct it first. Thank you guys very much for watching this, and I hope you learned something valuable, and I'm more than happy to take questions now.
So has anyone any questions for Michael? Michael was brilliant, full of really, really interesting information, new information. So has anyone any questions for Michael to begin with?
Don't be shy.
I was just thinking, you were talking about the bonds, and they come in all shapes and sizes. Is there any similarity? Well, I mean, obviously, one of the castles they were bringing in was Italian architects,
Yeah.
but are these things just organic regional masons building the bonds, or is there any sense, have you ever picked up any sense that there were masons who specialized in building bonds, and can you see kind of parallels, obviously apart from corner flankers or things like that?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. I think with Masonic skills, you kind of build a structural package, whereas you see in the second last slide there, the castle contract, you basically got your castle and your bond being built in a 2-for-1 kind of deal.
Yeah.
So I think when it comes to examining bonds, castles, and churches, effectively you're building towers, you're building walls, and so it's not a huge stretch for a mason who's building a tower house to go and build a bond wall instead. So I do think that if you employ a Masonic skill, you get a general structural package. However, it goes about saying that you could always employ the local community to help you build a bond from local sources and leave the professional heavy duty building to the actual masons to build a tower house. But as a rule, I think 2-for-1 deal.
Yeah, and there's no reference to in any of the Irish annals or other documents to named builders apart from the one that you showed me.
Unfortunately, not. The annals are not particularly good at room types or structural types. We do get mentions to castles and towers, and we get also reference to cellars being utilized as buyers, but that's as far as the details would go in the annals. Again, I would stick to the 17th century records are much better, I think, than the medieval records, but it's entirely down to what you interpret and what countries you're looking at. Because as you can see, the evidence for Wexford is more substantial than it is for Donegal. I think that's ultimately possibly because it was an Anglo-Irish settlement, Wexford, that it was easier for the surveyor to get around and actually record these settlements.
Yeah, and I'm going to hand over to there's some other people ask questions, but I'll just throw in one last one. I mean, these things are substantial undertakings, and presumably these masons had to learn somewhere. So are they coming from the main towns, or are they being trained? Where are they being trained? There must be kind of organization and experience behind them, and how many thousand were built over a couple of centuries. It's for these people who are actually the people who are actually building it. It's just, to me, it's kind of, gosh, these are the people who aren't, they're building the castles, but they're not actually being recorded who it is or where they were trained, or
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the evidence for contracts and evidence for Masonic skills is fairly dismal, I'm afraid. But as you mentioned earlier, it seems to me, certainly from what I've gathered, that the Masonic skills will be traveling. Basically, they go where the money's coming from. So if you're, for example, an O'Neill, and you go down to, this is hypothetical purely, you go down to County Cork and you go to McCarthy Castle and you have a splendid time and you're bowled over by the appearance of the castle. It's very simple, simply a case of inquiring as to who the mason was and paying them to travel with you. It's very much like today that if anybody gets a new conservatory or anything like that, or like a new roof or attachment, you always ask, oh, who's the guy or who's the woman who done that extension. So it's word of mouth and traveling, I think, primarily.
Yeah. Okay. So I have a couple of questions here from Annie. Has any geophysics been carried out in the vicinity of the Tower House to locate possible remnants of the bonds which have been robbed out or otherwise removed. So I wonder, do you know how much geophysics has been carried out in the environs of these monuments, these upstanding monuments?
That's a good question. Geophys is fairly few and far between, but it's I do have an article published a few years ago. I'm not aware of any geophysical surveys off the top of my head because they are few and far between, but I will certainly chase it up for you later.
Yeah, and then another question, is it possible that some of the tower houses in family clusters never had a bawn and that in times of trouble they would have taken refuge in a larger property nearby?
That's entirely possible as well, and that's certainly the case with very close-knit coastal communities such as the Omanis, Bay Biscayles, because of the relative poor quality soil and that kind of thing. It actually was a useful deterrent for many raiding parties. So even if you go to the north coast in Antrim and you go to the likes of Kinbane or Dunsterry castles, I mean, these castles are as far remote as you can be. So I reckon the most appropriate title for those tower houses would be retreat towers. So rather than gathering in one major huge castle, they would actually travel to as remote a castle as possible.
Yeah.
The problem is if you are gathered all together in one castle and doesn't have a bawn, I mean, you can only stay in a tower house so long as you have food and supplies, and that's excluding the possibility that if you're not burnt out of the castle, because ventilation is very poor in tower houses, and we do know that in a couple of castle sieges that even if you take shelter within the actual tower house itself, all you have to do is set fire to the castle door, and the smoke travels up the spiral staircase, and you're last bashed into the parapets, and you've got nowhere to go.
Yeah.
So I think retreat towers, keeping as far away as possible, is your best escape.
Yeah. Let's see what else. So you've given us case studies, the 4 case studies and the other case studies. Have you analysed all the counties in Ireland, or just those 4? Or
just those 4, because I'll tell you, it took me months to do those, especially the likes of County Cork and Galway. It would be great if we had a lot more. I think the thing is, the surveys have been done. Effectively, the first phase of them have been done in archaeological survey and an archaeological inventory. So the foundation for the survey work has been done, but what I call for is a reassessment of the SMR rather than necessarily new fieldwork being conducted. Because in light of many of these antiquary images and sketches and even photographs coming to light, I think it's important we combine them and marry them together.
And have you been in touch with the kind of archaeological survey bodies north and south to kind of raise these questions?
No, that would be my next count. I will come to them with a tally sheet saying you guys missed 20 bonds. Like
yeah. No, I mean, it's a fantastic interpretation and use of multiple sources, Michael. I mean, really impressive. And as somebody said, it does make you look at these castles anew. I mean, we always talk about sites and their setting, but I think we need to look with renewed vigor.
I completely agree. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone else? Any questions? Anyone want to shout anything out?
There's a few in the chat box, maybe.
Yeah, well, these are the ones I was reading from. So there's someone's asked about you mentioned flying a drone at Carrigafoyle. Have you done that at many sites, and what type of data do you collect and analyze?
That's a good question. Obviously, drone photography is weather permitting, and obviously living in County Down, you have to be very selective as to what type of site you go to and the accessibility as well, and the weather and that kind of thing. I will say not so much for Ireland, but certainly for England and Scotland whenever I was over. I use a lot of drone photography because I think it's easier to pick up the different kinds of features, including the bonds. In terms of, it's very difficult to spot a bond or ancillary features unless the conditions are just right. If we had another heat wave this summer, I would have been right down south, but unfortunately, it's not the case. It's all weather permitting, but drone photography, I think, is the next potential in terms of both for 3D modeling and geophysical survey, because you can also attach LiDAR to some drones as well to produce images as well. that's a bit beyond both myself and my budget, but that's certainly somewhere down the line.
Okay. Someone else, counties were all coastal. Was there any particular reason for the choice, for a choice of coastal counties?
Pretty simple reason. Obviously, you have access to fish and waterways. Very important means of getting around, obviously, waterways. And I mentioned earlier at Carrigafoyle, you obviously had a Spanish garrison there. Don't forget that if you're living along the west coast, like, for example, Gráinne O'Malley famously was, she was the pirate queen. She clearly knew the waterways around the west coast of Mayo. But also further down south, there was very huge maritime network. So in terms of trade, so there'd be fish and wines from the continent as well. So I think having it on the coast both acts as a useful source for sustenance, for fishing, and also for control, like so Dungorry Castle in Kinvara and Galway. It was used to control the entrance to the River Shannon. So it's for control, for sustenance, as well as for communication. That's primarily the reason why they're so closely on the coast, but also on riverways in general. At Oak and Ure Castle, there's actually a river that runs along the site as well. So that would have provided a useful source of transportation as well as a natural defense as well.
Yeah. I think we also forget that sort of around the coast, I mean, things like seaweed or reeds things were made out of kind of reeds. You got chairs, you got all sorts of boxes. If you look at some of the folklore programs recorded by RTE in the 50s and 60s, the amount of stuff that you could build or utilize from along a riverside for making things. I mean, they're all really quite apart from the kind of fish resources and travel. Rivers are a fantastic resource. I think we've lost a lot of our knowledge of how to kind of exploit, shall we say, in terms of things like the reeds, etc.
Yeah.
Okay, I have another question here. Back in the early 2000s, the Dr. Eamon O'Donoghue took a lot of early winter morning photographs from a light aircraft. They showed up an extraordinary range of ancillary works to tower houses that were invisible in the ground. That's from Dermot McGrandle. So, had you encountered these before?
No, not to the best of my knowledge, but I obviously understand the archaeological potential of such sites. I did actually believe whenever I was at Roxtown Castle that I may have caught the outline of the bond because there's clear discoloration in the grass. Because whenever I visited during 2019, there was a heat wave, fortunately, and I was able to pick up the bond. So again, photography like that is very much weather dependent. I would not pretend to be an expert. I would defer to others. So.
Okay, thank you. And then UAS's David has asked, has there been much work done on the routeways between the tower houses?
So in terms of routeways, I would very much, that's not my area of expertise. I would defer to Vicky McAllister. She wrote a book on the Irish Tower House. Fantastic book in terms of the environmental and social works of Irish Tower Houses. I would defer to that. I would not be, especially an expert in routeways.
Okay, no, that's a fair enough answer. Thank you very much. Let's see if there's any other. Just going through the questions here. And someone earlier on said, my father Conhard was born within half a mile of Desert O'Day Castle and was buried within a quarter of a mile of it. So that's quite a nice kind of.
That's a very nice connection.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to realize as well. I mean, it's only a few centuries apart from the occupants of these castles and where we are today. So there is a lot of family ties down the line. I mean, I'm sure if we were to trace our ancestry back a couple of centuries, there is probably a distant connection to many of these castles. So it's good to see people being buried in what they seem to be ancestral homelands, for example. So it's comforting to see that there's still a life history or life cycle to the sites.
Yeah, connection, absolutely. Yeah. Any other questions for Michael? Anyone? No one else seems to be typing. It's a lot to take in there. I'm not sure. Maybe you'll allow us to keep this and put this up on our YouTube.
By all means, far away. And if anybody has any more questions, I do have a Facebook and a Twitter account, but I also have a LinkedIn profile. If anybody wants to message me, even after this, or even drop a comment under the YouTube video, I'll be more than happy to reply.
That's brilliant, because I think there's so much information there, Michael. It will repay several viewings, so it's absolutely superb, and absolute great work done so far, and more to come, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely. Plenty more to come. Still need to publish the thesis.
Oh, well, we'll look forward to that. It'll be brilliant. So thank you so much for giving us such a detailed and thought-provoking and a well-illustrated talk. So very much appreciated, and it's a lovely way to end of our year of lecture. So thank you so much.
No worries at all. Thank you very much, everybody else, for attending.
Okay. Well, happy Christmas to you, Michael, as well.
Thank you very much, and happy Christmas to you all as well.
And we'll see you in the new year. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think, Duncan, unless there's any other questions, maybe we'll draw the evening to a close. Duncan there?
Yeah, it's fine. I'll finish this off.
Okay, and say thanks again to Michael for that. It was brilliant. So, okay. Well, good night, everybody. And hopefully we'll see you next week for Liam Ogie McGill's workshop. So I'm going to head off myself now. Okay. Night night.
Aye.